Shri Gurubhyo Namaha children. We welcome you to our online teaching academy, Ekalaiva. This video is the continuation of chapter 5, Footprints Without Feet from your supplementary reader, CBSE class 10. In the previous video, we knew about a scientist named Griffin and his rare formula of invisibility. He developed a drug which made his body invisible, but he can be only felt physically. Then he misuses his power to steal money, clothes, and food. He found difficult to stay in London with such power, so he decides to move to a small village, Epping. In the village, people were skeptical about him and looked at him strangely. Let me unfold the remaining story, children. Without making any noise and with a poker grasped firmly in his hand, the clergyman flung open the door. Surrender. Priest tightly held an iron rod in his hand. Without making any noise, he suddenly opened the door and shouted to surrender. Then, to his amazement, he realized that the room appeared to be empty. He and his wife looked under the desk and behind the curtains and even up the chimney. There wasn't a sign of anybody. Yet the desk had been opened and the housekeeping money was missing. He was surprised to see that the room was empty. He and his wife looked everywhere in the room, but there was nobody in the room. In spite of that, the desk had been opened and the money kept for their daily expenses was not there. Extraordinary affairs, the clergyman kept saying for the rest of the day. The priest kept saying for the remaining day that it was an extraordinary incident. But it was not as extraordinary as the behavior of Mrs. Hall's furniture a little later that morning. But later during the day, another more extraordinary incident happened. The furniture of Mrs. Hall started moving in a peculiar manner. The landlord and his wife were up very early and were surprised to see the scientist's door wide open. Usually it was shut and locked, and he was furious if anyone entered his room. Mr. and Mrs. Hall had woken up very early in the morning. They were surprised to see that the door of the scientist's room was fully open. Normally, the door used to remain closed and locked. He would become very angry if anyone entered his room. The opportunity seemed too good to be missed. They peeped round the door, saw nobody, and decided to investigate. Mr. and Mrs. Hall thought that it was an excellent opportunity to go into the room. They did not want to miss this chance. They peeped through the open door. There was nobody in the room. So they decided to enter the room to find out more about the scientist. The bedclothes were cold, showing that the scientist must have been up for some time. And stranger still, the clothes and bandages that he always wore were lying about the room. The clothes of the bed were cold, meaning that the scientist had not been in the bed for some time. The clothes and the bandages that the scientist was always wearing were spread in the room. Mr. and Mrs. Hall found this very strange. All of a sudden, Mrs. Hall heard a sniff close to her ear. A moment later, the hat on the bedpost leapt up and dashed itself into her face. Then the bedroom chair became alive. Sniff meaning sound of cough or sneeze. Suddenly, Mrs. Hall heard sound of a sniff near her ear. Immediately after that, the hat that was hanging on the bedpost of the bed jumped. This is the bedpost. From here, the hat jumped. The hat struck on the face of Mrs. Hall. Then the bedroom chair became alive. Then chairs of the bedroom started moving. Springing into the air, it charged straight at her, legs foremost. The chair jumped in the air and it rushed directly towards Mrs. Hall. Legs of the chair were pointed towards Mrs. Hall. As she and her husband turned away in terror, the extraordinary chair pushed them both out of the room and then appeared to slam and lock the door after them. Mrs. Hall and her husband were afraid and moved away from the chair. The unusual chair pushed both of them out of the room. The chair was put down violently on floor. The door was locked after they had come out of the room. Mrs. Hall almost fell down the stairs in hysterics. Mrs. Hall almost fell down the stairs due to her extreme anger. She was convinced that the door was haunted by spirits and that the stranger had somehow caused these to enter into her furniture. She became sure that there were ghosts in the room. The stranger had done something to enter those ghosts into her furniture. My poor mother used to sit in that chair, she moaned. To think it should rise up against me now. Moaned meaning spoke painfully. She spoke painfully that her mother used to sit on that chair. Mrs. Hall cannot even think that that chair could ever try to attack her. The feeling among the neighbors was that the trouble was caused by witchcraft. Witchcraft meaning magic. The neighbors thought that the problem of moving furniture was created by magic. But witchcraft or not, when news of the burglary at the clergyman's home became known, the, the strange scientist was strongly suspected of having had a hand in it. When people came to know about the theft in the house of the priest, they had a doubt that the stranger was involved in the theft. Suspicion grew even stronger when he suddenly produced some ready cash, though he had admitted not long before that he had no money. Their doubt became stronger when the stranger suddenly paid the rent in cash to Mrs. Hall, because some days ago the stranger had accepted that he did not have money. The village constable was secretly sent for. The police constable of the village was secretly called. Instead of waiting for the constable, Mrs. Hall went to the scientist, who had somehow mysteriously appeared from his empty bedroom. But Mrs. Hall did not wait for the constable. She went to the scientist and inquired him about how he had appeared from the empty bedroom, and she was very sure that she did not see him coming from outside. Mysteriously meaning secretly. I want to know what you have been doing to my chair upstairs, she demanded, and I want to know how it is you came out of an empty room and how you entered a locked room. She asked him that she wanted to know what had he done to her chair. She wanted to know how he had come out of the empty room, and she also wanted to know how he entered the room when the door was locked. The scientist was always quick tempered. Now he became furious. The scientist would always become angry easily, but now he was very angry. You don't understand who or what I am, he shouted. Very well, I will show you. Griffin shouted that Mrs. Hall did not know who he was. He said now he would show her what he was. Suddenly he threw off bandages, whiskers, spectacles, and even nose. It took him only a minute to do this. Suddenly he removed his bandage, whiskers, goggles, and also the nose. He did that in less than 1 minute. The horrified people in the bar found themselves staring at a headless man. The people of the bar got afraid. They were looking at a person who did not have a head. Mr. Jeffers, the constable, now arrived and was quite surprised to find that he had to arrest a man without a head. The constable, Mr. Jeffers, reached there at that time. He was surprised to note that he was supposed to arrest a headless person. But Jeffers was not easily prevented from doing his duty. If a magistrate's warrant ordered a person's arrest, then That person had to be arrested, with or without his head. But Jeffers did not stop in performing his duty. The constable thought that if the order of the magistrate asked to arrest a person, that person had to be arrested. It does not matter if the person has a head or does not have a head. There followed a remarkable scene as the policeman tried to get hold of a man who was becoming more and more invisible as he threw off one garment after another. Now people saw a strange scene. A policeman was trying to arrest a person who was becoming more and more invisible. The person was removing clothes from his body one by one. Finally, a shirt flew into the air, and the constable found himself struggling with someone he could not see at all. Some people tried to help him, but found themselves hit by blows that seemed to come from nowhere. Finally, the scientist removed his shirt and threw it in the air. The constable was fighting with a person whom he could not see. Some people tried to help him, but they were hit by blows. They could not see from where these blows were coming. In the end, Jeffers was knocked unconscious as he made a last attempt to hold on to the unseen scientist. Jeffers made his last attempt to catch the invisible scientist. In the end, Jeffers became unconscious and he fell down. There were nervous, excited cries of holding, but this was easier said than done. Griffin had shaken himself free, and no one knew where to lay hands on him. People nervously started shouting, "Hold him," so that somebody will catch the scientist. But it was easy to say such words, but difficult to actually catch him. Griffin had become free from the hold of Jeffers. Nobody knew how to arrest him. I hope you would have enjoyed the story. If you want to know further about the scientist Griffin, read the novel The Invisible One written by H.G. Wells. Do subscribe our YouTube channel for further updates. Thank you, children.